Volume 1, Section 9 of the Life of Charlotte Brontë. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie van Wallichem. The Life of Charlotte Brontë by Elizabeth Gaskell. Volume 1, Section 9. Chapter 7. Miss Brontë left Roe Head in 1832, having won the affectionate regard both of her teacher and her schoolfellows, and having formed there the two fast friendships which lasted her whole life long, the one with Mary, who has not kept her letters, the other with E., who has kindly entrusted me with a large portion of Miss Brontë's correspondence with her. This she has been induced to do by her knowledge of the urgent desire on the part of Mr. Brontë that the life of his daughter should be written, and in compliance with a request from her husband that I should be permitted to have the use of these letters, without which such a task could be but very imperfectly executed. In order to shield this friend, however, from any blame or misconstruction, it is only right to state that, before granting me this privilege, she throughout most carefully and completely effaced the names of the persons and places which occurred in them, and also that such information as I have obtained from her bears reference solely to Miss Brontë and her sisters, and not to any other individuals whom I may find it necessary to allude to in connection with them. In looking over the earlier portion of this correspondence, I am struck afresh by the absence of hope which formed such a strong characteristic in Charlotte, at an age when girls in general look forward to an eternal duration of such feelings as they or their friends entertain, and can therefore see no hindrance to the fulfilment of any engagements dependent on the future state of the affections. She is surprised that E. keeps a promise to write. In after life I was painfully impressed with the fact that Miss Brontë never dared to allow herself to look forward with hope, that she had no confidence in the future, and I thought, when I heard of the sorrowful years she had passed through, that it had been this pressure of grief which had crushed all buoyancy of expectation out of her. But it appears from the letters that it must have been, so to speak, constitutional, or perhaps the deep pang of losing her two elder sisters combined with a permanent state of bodily weakness in producing her hopelessness. If her trust in God had been less strong, she would have given way to unbounded anxiety at many a period of her life. As it was, we shall see she made a great and successful effort to leave her times in his hands. After her return home, she employed herself in teaching her sisters, over whom she had had superior advantages. She writes thus, July 21st, 1832, of her course of life at the parsonage. An account of one day is an account of all. In the morning, from 9 o'clock till 12:30, I instruct my sisters, and draw, then we walk till dinner time. After dinner I sew till tea time, and after tea I either write, read, or do a little fancy work, or draw, as I please. Thus in one delightful, though somewhat monotonous course, my life is passed. I have been only out twice to tea since I came home. We are expecting company this afternoon, and on Tuesday next we shall have all the female teachers of the Sunday school to tea. I may here introduce a quotation from a letter which I have received from Mary since the publication of the previous editions of this memoir. Soon after leaving school she admitted reading something of Cobbett's. She did not like him, she said, but all was fish that came to her net. At this time she wrote to me that reading and drawing were the only amusements she had, and that her supply of books was very small in proportion to her wants. She never spoke of her aunt. When I saw Miss Branwell, she was a very precise person, and looked very odd, because her dress, etc., so utterly out of fashion. She corrected one of us once for using the word spit or spitting. She made a great favourite of Branwell. She made her nieces sew, with purpose or without, and as far as possible discouraged any other culture. She used to keep the girls sewing charity clothing, and maintained to me that it was not for the good of the recipients, but of the sewers. It was proper for them to do it, she said. Charlotte never was in wild excitement, that I know of. When in health she used to talk better, and indeed when in low spirits never spoke at all. She needed her best spirits to say what was in her heart, for at other times she had not courage. She never gave decided opinions at such times. Charlotte said she could get on with any one who had a bump at the top of their heads, meaning conscientiousness. I found that I seldom differed from her, except that she was far too tolerant of stupid people, if they had a grain of kindness in them. It was about this time that Mr. Brontë provided his children with a teacher in drawing, who turned out to be a man of considerable talent, but very little principle. Although they never attained to anything like proficiency, they took great interest in inquiring this art, evidently from an instinctive desire to express their powerful imaginations in visible forms. Charlotte told me that at this period of her life, drawing and walking out with her sisters formed the two great pleasures and relaxations of her day. The three girls used to walk upwards toward the purple-black moors, the sweeping surface of which was broken by here and there a stone quarry, and if they had strength and time to go far enough, they reached a waterfall, where the beck fell over some rocks into the bottom. They seldom went downwards through the village. They were shy of meeting even familiar faces, and were scrupulous about entering the house of the very poorest uninvited. They were steady teachers at the Sunday school, a habit which Charlotte kept up very faithfully, even after she was left alone, but they never faced their kind voluntary, and always preferred the solitude and freedom of the moors. In the September of this year, Charlotte went to pay her first visit to her friend E. It took her into the neighbourhood of Roe Head, and brought her into pleasant contact with many of her old schoolfellows. After this visit she and her friend seemed to have agreed to correspond in French for the sake of improvement in the language. But this improvement could not be great when it could only amount to a greater familiarity with dictionary words, and when there was no one to explain to them that a verbal translation of English idioms hardly constituted French composition. But the effort was laudable, and of itself shows how willing they both were to carry on the education which they had begun under Miss W. I will give an extract which, whatever may be thought of the language, is graphic enough, and presents us with a happy little family picture, the eldest sister returning home to the two younger, after a fortnight's absence. J'arrivai à Haworth en parfaite sauveté, sans le moindre accident ou malheur. Mes petites sœurs couraient hors de la maison pour me rencontrer aussitôt que la voiture se fit voir, et elles m'embrassaient avec autant d'empressement et de plaisir comme si j'avais été absente pour plus d'un. Mon papa, ma tante et le monsieur dont mon frère avait parlé furent tous assemblés dans le salon, et en peu de temps je m'y rendis aussi. C'est souvent l'ordre du ciel que quand on a perdu un plaisir il y a un autre prêt à prendre sa place. Ainsi je venais de partir de très chers amis, Mais tout à l'heure je rêvais à des parents aussi chers et bons dans le moment. Même que vous me perdiez, ose-je croire que mon départ vous était un chagrin? Vous attendîtes l'arrivée de votre frère et de votre sœur. J'ai donné à mes sœurs les pommes que vous leur envoyez avec tant de bonté. Elles disent qu'elles sont sûres que mademoiselle est très aimable et bonne. L'une et l'autre sont extrêmement impatientes de vous voir. J'espère qu'en peu de mois elles auront ce plaisir. But it was some time yet before the friends could meet, and meanwhile they agreed to correspond once a month. There were no events to chronicle in the Howarth letters. Quiet days, occupied in reading, and feminine occupations in the house did not present much to write about, and Charlotte was naturally driven to criticise books. Of these there were many in different plights, and according to their plight kept in different places. The well-bound were ranged in the sanctuary of Mr. Bronte's study, but the purchase of books was a necessary luxury to him. But as it was often a choice between binding an old one or buying a new one, the familiar volume, which had been hungrily read by all the members of the family, was sometimes in such a condition that the bedroom shelf was considered its fitting place. Up and down the house were to be found many standard works of a solid kind. Sir Walter Scott's writings, Wordsworth's, and Southey's poems were among the lighter literature, while, as having a character of their own, earnest, wild, and occasionally fanatical, may be named some of the books which came from the Branwell side of the family, from the Cornish followers of the saintly John Wesley, and which are touched on in the account of the works to which Caroline Helstone had access in Shirley. Some venerable ladies' magazines that had once performed a voyage with their owner and undergone a storm, possibly part of the relics of Mrs. Bronte's possessions, contained in the ship wrecked on the coast of Cornwall, and whose pages were stained with salt water. Some mad Methodist magazines, full of miracles and apparitions, and preternatural warnings, ominous dreams, and frenzied fanaticisms, and the equally mad letters of Mrs. Elizabeth Rowe from the dead to the living. Mr. Brontë encouraged the taste for reading in his girls, and though Miss Branwell kept it in due bounds by the variety of household occupations, in which she expected them not merely to take a part, but to become proficient, thereby occupying regularly a good portion of every day, they were allowed to get books from the circulating library at Keighley, and many a happy walk up those long 4 miles must they have had, burdened with some new book into which they peeped as they hurried home. Not that the books were what would generally be called new in the beginning of 1833. The two friends seem almost simultaneously to have fallen upon Kenilworth, and Charlotte writes as follows about it: "I am glad you like Kenilworth. It is certainly more resembling a romance than a novel in my opinion, one of the most interesting works that ever emanated from the great Sir Walter's pen. Varney is certainly the personification of consummate villainy, and in the delineation of his dark and profoundly artful mind, Scott exhibits a wonderful knowledge of human nature, as well as a surprising skill in embodying his perceptions so as to enable others to become participators in that knowledge." Commonplace as this extract may seem, it is noteworthy on 2 or 3 accounts. In the first place, instead of discussing the plot or story, she analyses the character of Varney; and next, she, knowing nothing of the world, both from her youth and her isolated position, has yet been so accustomed to hear human nature distrusted as to receive the notion of intense and artful villainy without surprise. What was formal and set in her way of writing to E. diminished as their personal acquaintance increased. and as each came to know the home of the other, so that small details concerning people and places had their interest and their significance. In the summer of 1833 she wrote to invite her friend to come and pay her a visit. "Aunt thought it would be better," she says, "to defer it until about the middle of summer, as the winter and even the spring seasons are remarkably cold and bleak among our mountains." The first impression made on the visitor by the sisters of a school friend was, that Emily was a tall, long-armed girl, more fully grown than her elder sister, extremely reserved in manner. I distinguish reserve from shyness, because I imagine shyness would please if it knew how, whereas reserve is indifferent whether it pleases or not. Anne, like her eldest sister, was shy. Emily was reserved. Branwell was rather a handsome boy with tawny hair, to use Miss Bronte's phrase for a more obnoxious colour. All were very clever, original, and utterly different to any people or family E. had ever seen before. But on the whole it was a happy visit to all parties. Charlotte said in writing to E. just after her return home, "Were I to tell you of the impression you have made on every one here, you would accuse me of flattery. Papa and aunt are continually adducing you as an example for me to shape my actions and behaviour by. Emily and Anne say they never saw any one they liked so well as you. Aunt Tabby, whom you have absolutely fascinated, talked a great deal more nonsense about your ladyship than I care to repeat. It is now so dark that, notwithstanding the singular property of seeing in the night-time, which the young ladies at Roe Head used to attribute to me, I can scribble no longer." To a visitor at the parsonage, it was a great thing to have Tabby's good word. She had a Yorkshire keenness of perception into character, and it was not everybody she liked. Haworth is built with an utter disregard of all sanitary conditions. The great old churchyard lies above all the houses, and it is terrible to think how the very water-springs of the pumps below must be poisoned. But this winter of 1833-34 was particularly wet and rainy, and there were an unusual number of deaths in the village. A dreary season it was to the family in the parsonage. Their usual walks obstructed by the spongy state of the moors, the passing and funeral bells so frequently tolling, and filling the heavy air with their mournful sound, and when they were still, the chip-chip of the mason as he cut the gravestones in a shed close by. In many, living as it were in a churchyard, and with all the sights and sounds connected with the last offices to the dead things of every-day occurrence, the very familiarity would have bred indifference. But it was otherwise with Charlotte Brontë. One of her friends says, "I have seen her turn pale and feel faint, when in Hardshead Church some one accidentally remarked that we were walking over graves." Charlotte was certainly afraid of death, not only of dead bodies or dying people. She dreaded it as something horrible. She thought we did not know how long the moment of dissolution might really be, or how terrible. This was just such a terror as only hypochondriacs can provide for themselves. She told me long ago that a misfortune was often preceded by the dream frequently repeated, which he gives to Jane Eyre, of carrying a little wailing child and being unable to still it. She described herself as having the most painful sense of pity for the little thing, lying inert as sick children do, while she walked about in some gloomy place with it, such as the aisle of Haworth Church. The misfortunes she mentioned were not always to herself. She thought such sensitiveness to omens was like the cholera, present to susceptible people, some feeling more, some less. About the beginning of 1834, E. went to London for the first time. The idea of her friend's visit seemed to have stirred Charlotte strangely. She appears to have formed her notions of its probable consequences from some of the papers in the British essayists, the Rambler, the Mirror, or the Lounger, which may have been among the English classics on the parsonage bookshelves, for she evidently imagines that an entire change of character for the worse is the usual effect of a visit to the great metropolis, and is delighted to find that E is E still. And as her faith in her friend's stability is restored, her own imagination is deeply moved by the idea of what great wonders are to be seen in that vast and famous city. Haworth, February 20th, 1834. Your letter gave me real and heartfelt pleasure, mingled with no small share of astonishment. Mary had previously informed me of your departure for London, and I had not ventured to calculate on any communication from you while surrounded by the splendours and novelties of that great city, which has been called the mercantile metropolis of Europe. Judging from human nature, I thought that a little country girl, for the first time in a situation so well calculated to excite curiosity and to distract attention, would lose all remembrance, for a time at least, of distant and familiar objects, and give herself up entirely to the fascination of those scenes which were then presented to her view. Your kind, interesting, and most welcome epistle showed me, however, that I had been both mistaken and uncharitable in these suppositions. I was greatly amused at the tone of nonchalance which you assumed while treating of London and its wonders. Did you not feel awed while gazing at St. Paul's and Westminster Abbey? Had you no feeling of intense and ardent interest when in St. James's you saw the palace where so many of England's kings have held their courts, and beheld the representations of their persons on the walls? You should not be too much afraid of appearing country-bred. The magnificence of London has drawn exclamations of astonishment from travelled men experienced in the world, its wonders and beauties. Have you yet seen anything of the great personages whom the sitting of Parliament now detains in London? The Duke of Wellington, Sir Robert Peel, Earl Grey, Mr. Stanley, Mr. O'Connell? If I were you, I would not be too anxious to spend my time in reading whilst in town. Make use of your own eyes for the purposes of observation now, and, for a time at least, lay aside the spectacles with which authors would furnish us. In a postscript she adds, will you be kind enough to inform me of the number of performers in the King's military band? And in something of the same strain she writes on June 19th, my own dear E. I may rightfully and truly call you so now. You have returned, or are returning from London, from the great city which is to me as apocryphal as Babylon, or Nineveh, or ancient Rome. You are withdrawing from the world, as it is called, and bringing with you, if your letters enable me to form a correct judgment, a heart as unsophisticated, as natural, as true, as that you carried there. I am slow, very slow, to believe the protestations of another. I know my own sentiments, I can read my own mind, but the minds of the rest of man and womankind are to me sealed volumes, hieroglyphical scrolls, which I cannot easily either unseal or decipher. Yet time, careful study, long acquaintance, overcome most difficulties, and in your case, I think they have succeeded well in bringing to light and construing that hidden language, whose turnings, windings, inconsistencies, and obscurities so frequently baffle the researches of the honest observer of human nature. I am truly grateful for your mindfulness of so obscure a person as myself, and I hope the pleasure is not altogether selfish. I trust It is partly derived from the consciousness that my friend's character is of a higher, a more steadfast order than I was once perfectly aware of. Few girls would have done as you have done, would have beheld the glare and glitter and dazzling display of London with dispositions so unchanged, hearts so uncontaminated. I see no affectation in your letters, no trifling, no frivolous contempt of plain and weak admiration of showy persons and things. In these days of cheap railway trips, we may smile at the idea of a short visit to London having any great effect upon the character, whatever it may have upon the intellect. But her London, her great apocryphal city, was the town of a century before, to which giddy daughters dragged unwilling papas, or went with injudicious friends to the detriment of all their better qualities, and sometimes to the ruin of their fortunes. It was the Vanity Fair of the Pilgrim's Progress to her. But see the just and admirable sense with which she can treat a subject of which she is able to overlook all the bearings. Haworth, July 4th, 1834. In your last you request me to tell you of your faults. Now really, how can you be so foolish? I won't tell you of your faults, because I don't know them. What a creature would that be who, after receiving an affectionate and kind letter from a beloved friend, should sit down and write a catalogue of defects by way of answer? Imagine me doing so, and then consider what epithets you would bestow on me. Conceited, dogmatical, hypocritical little humbug, I should think, would be the mildest. Why, child, I've neither time nor inclination to reflect on your faults, when you are so far from me, and when, besides, kind letters and presents and so forth are continually bringing forth your goodness in the most prominent light. Then, too, there are judicious relations always round you, who can much better discharge that unpleasant office. I have no doubt their advice is completely at your service. Why then should I intrude mine? If you will not hear them, it will be vain though one should rise from the dead to instruct you. Let us have no more nonsense, if you love me. Mr. Blank is going to be married, is he? Well, his wife-elect appeared to me to be a clever and amiable lady, as far as I could judge from the little I saw of her, and from your account. Now to that flattering sentence must I tack on a list of her faults? You say it is in contemplation for you to leave . I am sorry for it. Is a pleasant spot, one of the old family halls of England, surrounded by lawn and woodland, speaking of past times, and suggesting, to me at least, happy feelings. Emma thought you grown less, did she? I am not grown a bit, but as short and dumpy as ever. You ask me to recommend to you some books for your perusal. I will do so in as few words as I can. If you like poetry, let it be first-rate. Milton, Shakespeare, Thomson, Goldsmith, Poe, if you will, though I don't admire him, Scott, Byron, Campbell, Wordsworth, and Southey. Now don't be startled at the names of Shakespeare and Byron. Both these were great men, and their works are like themselves. You will know how to choose the good and to avoid the evil. The finest passages are always the purest, the bad are invariably revolting. You will never wish to read them over twice. Omit the comedies of Shakespeare and the Don Juan, perhaps the Cain of Byron, though the latter is a magnificent poem, and read the rest fearlessly. That must indeed be a depraved mind which can gather evil from Henry VIII, from Richard III, from Macbeth and Hamlet and Julius Caesar. Scott's sweet, wild, romantic poetry can do you no harm, nor can Wordsworth's, nor Campbell's, nor Southey's. The greatest part, at least, of his, some is certainly objectionable. For history, read Hume, Rollin, and the Universal History, if you can. I never did. For fiction, read Scott alone. All novels after his are worthless. For biography, read Johnson's Lives of the Poets, Boswell's Life of Johnson, Southey's Life of Nelson, Lockhart's Life of Burns, Moore's Life of Sheridan, Moore's Life of Byron, Wolfe's Remains. For natural history, read Bewick and Audubon and Goldsmith and White's History of Selborne. For divinity, your brother will advise you there. I can only say, adhere to standard authors, and avoid novelty. From this list we see that she must have had a good range of books from which to choose her own reading. It is evident that the womanly consciences of these two correspondents were anxiously alive to many questions discussed among the stricter religionists. The morality of Shakespeare needed the confirmation of Charlotte's opinion to the sensitive E, and a little later she inquired whether dancing was objectionable when indulged in for an hour or two in parties of boys and girls. Charlotte replies, "I should hesitate to express a difference of opinion from Mr. or from your excellent sister, but really the matter seems to me to stand thus. It is allowed on all hands that the sin of dancing consists not in the mere action of shaking the shanks, as the Scotch say, but in the consequences that usually attend it, namely frivolity and waste of time. When it is used only, as in the case you state, for the exercise and amusement of an hour among young people, who surely may without any breach of God's commandments be allowed a little light-heartedness, these consequences cannot follow. Ergo, according to my manner of arguing, the amusement is at such times perfectly innocent." Although the distance between Haworth and B was but 17 miles, it was difficult to go straight from the one to the other without hiring a gig or vehicle of some kind for the journey. Hence a visit from Charlotte required a good deal of rearrangement. The Haworth gig was not always to be had, and Mr. Brontë was often unwilling to fall into any arrangement for meeting at Bradford or other places which would occasion trouble to others. The whole family had an ample share of that sensitive pride which led them to dread incurring obligations and to fear outstaying their welcome when on any visit. I am not sure whether Mr. Brontë did not consider distrust of others as a part of that knowledge of human nature on which he piqued himself. His precepts to this effect, combined with Charlotte's lack of hope, made her always fearful of loving too much, of varying the objects of her affection, and thus she was often trying to restrain her warm feelings, and was ever chary of that presence so invariably welcome to her true friends. According to this mode of acting, when she was invited for a month, she stayed but a fortnight amidst E.'s family, to whom every visit only endeared her the more, and by whom she was received with that kind of quiet gladness with which they would have greeted a sister. She still kept up her childish interest in politics. In March 1835 she writes, "What do you think of the course politics are taking? I make this inquiry because I now think you take a wholesome interest in the matter. Formerly you did not care greatly about it. B, you see, is triumphant. Wretch! I am a hearty hater, and if there is any one I thoroughly abhor, it is that man. But the opposition is divided, red-hots and lukewarms, and the Duke, par excellence the Duke, and Sir Robert feel show no signs of insecurity, though they have been twice beat. So courage, mon ami, as the old chevaliers used to say before they joined battle." In the middle of the summer of 1835, a great family plan was mooted at the parsonage. The question was to what trade or profession should Branwell be brought up. He was now nearly 18. It was time to decide. He was very clever, no doubt, perhaps to begin with, the greatest genius in this rare family. The sisters hardly recognized their own or each other's powers, but they knew his. The father, ignorant of many failings in moral conduct, did proud homage to the great gifts of his son, for Branwell's talents were readily and willingly brought out for the entertainment of others. Popular admiration was sweet to him, and this led to his presence being sought at Arvills and all the great village gatherings, for the Yorkshire men have a keen relish for intellect, and it likewise procured him the undesirable distinction of having his company recommended by the landlord of the Black Bull to any chance traveller who might happen to feel solitary or dull over his liquor. "Do you want some one to help you with your bottle, sir? If you do, I'll send up for Patrick." So the villagers called him till the day of his death, though in his own family he was always Branwell. And while the messenger went, the landlord entertained his guest with accounts of the wonderful talents of the boy, whose precocious cleverness and great conversational powers were the pride of the village. The attacks of ill health to which Mr. Brontë had been subject of late years rendered it not only necessary that he should take his dinner alone, for the sake of avoiding temptations to unwholesome diet, but made it also desirable that he should pass the time directly succeeding his meals in perfect quiet, and this necessity, combined with due attention to his parochial duties, made him partially ignorant how his son employed himself out of lesson-time. His own youth had been spent among people of the same conventional rank as of those into whose companionship Branwell was now thrown, but he had had a strong will, and an earnest and persevering ambition, and a resoluteness of purpose which his weaker son wanted. It is singular how strong a yearning the whole family had towards the art of drawing. Mr. Brontë had been very solicitous to get them good instruction. The girls themselves loved everything connected with it, all descriptions or engravings of great pictures, and in default of good ones, they would take and analyse any print or drawing which came in their way, and find out how much thought had gone to its composition, what ideas it was intended to suggest, and what it did suggest. In the same spirit they laboured to design imaginations of their own. They lacked the power of execution, not of conception. At one time Charlotte had the notion of making her living as an artist, and wearied her eyes in drawing with pre-Raphaelite minuteness, but not with pre-Raphaelite accuracy, for she drew from fancy rather than from nature. But they all thought there could be no doubt about Branwell's talent for drawing. I have seen an oil painting of his, done I know not when, but probably about this time. It was a group of his sisters, life-size, 3/4 length, not much better than sign-painting as to manipulation, but the likenesses were, I should think, admirable. I could only judge of the fidelity with which the other two were depicted from the striking resemblance which Charlotte, upholding the great frame of canvas, and consequently standing right behind it, bore to her own representation, though it must have been 10 years and more since the portraits were taken. The picture was divided almost in the middle by a great pillar. On the side of the column which was lighted by the sun stood Charlotte, in the womanly dress of that day of gigot sleeves and large collars. On the deeply shadowed side was Emily, with Anne's gentle face resting on her shoulder. Emily's countenance struck me as full of power, Charlotte's of solicitude, Anne's of tenderness. The two younger seemed hardly to have attained their full growth, though Emily was taller than Charlotte. They had cropped hair and a more girlish dress. I remember looking on those two sad, earnest, shadowed faces, and wondering whether I could trace the mysterious expression which is said to foretell an early death. I had some fond superstitious hope that the column divided their fates from hers, who stood apart in the canvas as in life she survived. I liked to see that the bright side of the pillar was towards her, that the light in the picture fell on her. I might more truly have sought in a presentment, nay, in her living face, for the sign of death, in her prime. They were good likenesses, however badly executed. From thence I should guess his family augured truly that if Branwell had but the opportunity, and the lass had but the moral qualities, he might turn out a great painter. The best way of preparing him to become so appeared to be to send him as a pupil to the Royal Academy. I dare say he longed and yearned to follow this path, principally because it would lead him to that mysterious London, that Babylon the Great, which seems to have filled the imaginations and haunted the minds of all the younger members of this recluse family. To Branwell it was more than a vivid imagination, it was an impressed reality. By dint of studying maps, he was as well acquainted with it, even down to its byways, as if he had lived there. Poor misguided fellow, this craving to see and know London, and that stronger craving after fame, were never to be satisfied. He was to die at the end of a short and blighted life. But in this year of 1835 all his home kindred were thinking how they could best forward his views, and how help him up to the pinnacle where he desired to be. What their plans were, let Charlotte explain. These are not the first sisters who have laid their lives as a sacrifice before their brother's idolized wish. Would to God they might be the last who met with such a miserable return. Haworth, July 6th, 1835. I had hoped to have had the extreme pleasure of seeing you at Haworth this summer, but human affairs are mutable, and human resolutions must bend to the course of events. We are all about to divide, break up, separate. Emily is going to school, Branwell is going to London, and I am going to be a governess. This last determination I formed myself, knowing that I should have to take the step some time, and better sooner syne, to use a Scotch proverb. And knowing well that papa would have enough to do with his limited income, should Branwell be placed at the Royal Academy and Emily at Roe Head. Where am I going to reside, you will ask? Within 4 miles of you, at a place neither of us is unacquainted with, being no other than the identical Roe Head mentioned above. Yes, I am going to teach in the very school where I was myself taught. Miss W. made me the offer, and I preferred it to 1 or 2 proposals of private governorship, which I had before received. I am sad, very sad at the thoughts of leaving home, but duty, necessity, these are stern mistresses who will not be disobeyed. Did I not once say you ought to be thankful for your independence? I felt what I said at the time, and I repeat it now with double earnestness. If anything would cheer me, it is the idea of being so near you. Surely you and Polly will come and see me. It would be wrong in me to doubt it. You were never unkind yet. Emily and I leave home on the 27th of this month. The idea of being together consoles us both somewhat. And truth, since I must enter a situation, my lines have fallen in pleasant places. I both love and respect Miss W. End of section 9.
Volume 1, Chapter 8 of The Life of Charlotte Brontë. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Life of Charlotte Brontë by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Volume 1, Chapter 8. On the 29th of July, 1835, Charlotte, now a little more than 19 years old, went as a teacher to Miss W.'s. Emily accompanied her as a pupil, but she became literally ill from homesickness, and could not settle to anything, and after passing only 3 months at Roe Head, returned to the parsonage and the beloved moors. Miss Brontë gives the following reasons as those which prevented Emily's remaining at school, and caused the substitution of her younger sister in her place at Miss W.'s. My sister Emily loved the moors. Flowers brighter than the rose bloomed in the blackest of the heath for her. Out of a sullen hollow in a livid hillside her mind could make an Eden. She found in the bleak solitude many and dear delights, and not the least and best loved was liberty. Liberty was the breath of Emily's nostrils. Without it she perished. The change from her own home to a school, and from her own very noiseless, very secluded, but unrestricted and unartificial mode of life, to one of disciplined routine, though under the kindest auspices, was what she failed in enduring. Her nature proved here too strong for her fortitude. Every morning when she woke, the vision of home and the moors rushed on her, and darkened and saddened the day that lay before her. Nobody knew what ailed her but me. I knew only too well. In this struggle her health was quickly broken. Her white face, attenuated form, and failing strength threatened rapid decline. I felt in my heart she would die if she did not go home, and with this conviction obtained her recall. She had only been 3 months at school, and it was some years before the experiment of sending her from home was again ventured on. This physical suffering on Emily's part when absent from Haworth, after recurring several times under similar circumstances, became at length so much an acknowledged fact, that whichever was obliged to leave home, the sisters decided that Emily must remain there, where alone she could enjoy anything like good health. She left it twice again in her life, once going as teacher to a school in Halifax for 6 months, and afterwards accompanying Charlotte to Brussels for 10. When at home she took the principal part of the cooking upon herself, and did all the household ironing, and after Tabby grew old and infirm, it was Emily who made all the bread for the family, and any one passing by the kitchen door might have seen her studying German out of an open book propped up before her, as she kneaded the dough, but no study, however interesting, interfered with the goodness of the bread, which was always light and excellent. Books were indeed a very common sight in that kitchen. The girls were taught by their father theoretically, and by their aunt practically, that to take an active part in all household work was in their position woman's simple duty, but in their careful employment of time they found many an odd 5 minutes for reading while watching the cakes, and managed the union of 2 kinds of employment better than King Alfred. Charlotte's life at Miss W.'s was a very happy one until her health failed. She sincerely loved and respected the former schoolmistress, to whom she was now become both companion and friend. The girls were hardly strangers to her, some of them being younger sisters of those who had been her own playmates. Though the duties of the day might be tedious and monotonous, there were always 2 or 3 happy hours to look forward to in the evening, when she and Miss W. sat together, sometimes late into the night, and had quiet, pleasant conversations, or pauses of silence as agreeable, because each felt that as soon as a thought or remark occurred which they wished to express, there was an intelligent companion ready to sympathize, and yet they were not compelled to make talk. Miss W. was always anxious to afford Miss Brontë every opportunity of recreation in her power, but the difficulty often was to persuade her to avail herself of the invitations which came, urging her to spend Saturday and Sunday with E. and Mary in their respective homes that lay within the distance of a walk. She was too apt to consider that allowing herself a holiday was a dereliction of duty, and to refuse herself the necessary change, from something of an over-ascetic spirit, betokening a loss of healthy balance in either body or mind. Indeed, it is clear that such was the case from a passage referring to this time in the letter of Mary, from which I have before given extracts. 3 years after, the period when they were at school together, I heard that she had gone as teacher to Miss W.'s. I went to see her, and asked how she could give so much for so little money, when she could live without it. She owned that after clothing herself and Anne there was nothing left, though she had hoped to be able to save something. She confessed it was not brilliant, but what could she do? I had nothing to answer. She seemed to have no interest or pleasure beyond the feeling of duty, and, when she could get, used to sit alone and make out. She told me afterwards that one evening she had sat in the dressing-room until it was quite dark, and then, observing it all at once, had taken sudden fright. No doubt she remembered this well when she described a similar terror getting hold upon Jane Eyre. She says in the story, "I sat looking at the white bed and overshadowed walls, occasionally turning a fascinated eye towards the gleaming mirror. I began to recall what I had heard of dead men troubled in their graves. I endeavored to be firm. Shaking my hair from my eyes, I lifted my head and tried to look boldly through the dark room. At this moment a ray from the moon penetrated some aperture in the blind. No! Moonlight was still, and this stirred. Prepared as my mind was for horror, shaken as my nerves were by agitation, I thought the swift darting beam was a herald of some coming vision from another world. My heart beat thick, my head grew hot, a sound filled my ears which I deemed the rustling of wings. Something seemed near me." Footnote: Jane Eyre, Volume 1, page 20. End of footnote. From that time, Mary adds, her imaginations became gloomy or frightful. She could not help it, nor help thinking. She could not forget the gloom, could not sleep at night, nor attend in the day. She told me that one night, sitting alone, about this time, she heard a voice repeat these lines: "Come thou high and holy feeling, shine o'er mountain, flit o'er wave, gleam like light o'er dome and shielding." There were 8 or 10 more lines which I forget. She insisted that she had not made them, that she had heard a voice repeat them. It is possible that she had read them and unconsciously recalled them. They are not in the volume of poems which the sisters published. She repeated a verse of Isaiah, which she said had inspired them, and which I have forgotten. Whether the lines were recollected or invented, the tale proves such habits of sedentary, monotonous solitude of thought as would have shaken a feebler mind. Of course, the state of health thus described came on gradually, and is not to be taken as a picture of her condition in 1836. Yet even then there is a despondency in some of her expressions that too sadly reminds one of some of Cowper's letters, and it is remarkable how deeply his poems impressed her. His words, his verses came more frequently to her memory, I imagine, than those of any other poet. Mary says, Cowper's poem The Castaway was known to them all, and they all at times appreciated or almost appropriated it. Charlotte told me once that Branwell had done so, and though his depression was the result of his faults, it was in no other respect different from hers. Both were not mental but physical illnesses. She was well aware of this, and would ask how that mended matters, as the feeling was there all the same, and was not removed by knowing the cause. She had a larger religious toleration than a person would have who had never questioned, and the manner of recommending religion was always that of offering comfort, not fiercely enforcing a duty. One time I mentioned that someone had asked me what religion I was of, with the view of getting me for a partisan, and that I had said that that was between God and me. Emily, who was lying on the hearth-rug, exclaimed, "That's right." This was all I ever heard Emily say on religious subjects. Charlotte was free from religious depression when in tolerable health. When that failed, her depression returned. You have probably seen such instances. They don't get over their difficulties, they forget them, when their stomach, or whatever organ it is that inflicts such misery on sedentary people, will let them. I have heard her condemn Socinianism, Calvinism, and many other isms inconsistent with Church of Englandism. I used to wonder at her acquaintance with such subjects. May 10th, 1836. I was struck with the note you sent me with the umbrella. It showed a degree of interest in my concerns which I have no right to expect from any earthly creature. I won't play the hypocrite. I won't answer your kind, gentle, friendly questions in the way you wish me to. Don't deceive yourself by imagining I have a bit of real goodness about me. My darling, if I were like you, I should have my face Zion ward, though prejudice and error might occasionally fling a mist over the glorious vision before me. But I am not like you. If you knew my thoughts, the dreams that absorb me, and the fiery imagination that at times eats me up and makes me feel society as it is wretchedly insipid, you would pity and I dare say despise me. But I know the treasures of the Bible. I love and adore them. I can see the well of life in all its clearness and brightness, but when I stoop down to drink of the pure waters they fly from my lips as if I were Tantalus. You are far too kind and frequent in your invitations. You puzzle me. I hardly know how to refuse, and it is still more embarrassing to accept. At any rate, I cannot come this week, for we are in the very thickest melee of the repetitions. I was hearing the terrible 5th section when your note arrived. But Miss Wooler says I must go to Mary next Friday, as she promised for me on Whit Sunday, and on Sunday morning I will join you at church, if it be convenient, and stay till Monday. There's a free and easy proposal. Miss W. has driven me to it. She says her character is implicated. Good, kind Miss W. However monotonous and trying were the duties Charlotte had to perform under her roof, there was always a genial and thoughtful friend watching over her, and urging her to partake of any little piece of innocent recreation that might come in her way. And in those midsummer holidays of 1836, her friend E. came to stay with her at Haworth, so there was one happy time secured. Here follows a series of letters not dated, but belonging to the latter portion of this year, and again we think of the gentle and melancholy Cowper. My dear, dear E., I am at this moment trembling all over with excitement after reading your note. It is what I never received before. It is the unrestrained pouring out of a warm, gentle, generous heart. I thank you with energy for this kindness. I will no longer shrink from answering your questions. I do wish to be better than I am. I pray fervently sometimes to be made so. I have stings of conscience, visitings of remorse, glimpses of holy, of inexpressible things which formerly I used to be a stranger to. It may all die away, and I may be in utter midnight, but I implore a merciful Redeemer that, if this be the dawn of the gospel, it may still brighten to perfect day. Do not mistake me. Do not think I am good. I only wish to be so. I only hate my former flippancy and forwardness. Oh, I am no better than ever I was. I am in that state of horrid, gloomy uncertainty that, at this moment, I would submit to be old, gray-haired, to have passed all my youthful days of enjoyment, and to be settling on the verge of the grave, if I could only thereby ensure the prospect of reconciliation to God and redemption through his Son's merits. I never was exactly careless of these matters, but I have always taken a clouded and repulsive view of them, and now, if possible, the clouds are gathering darker, and a more oppressive despondency weighs on my spirits. You have cheered me, my darling, for one moment. For an atom of time I thought I might call you my own sister in the spirit, but the excitement is past, and I am now as wretched and hopeless as ever. This very night I will pray as you wish me. May the Almighty hear me compassionately, and I humbly hope he will, for you will strengthen my polluted petitions with your own pure requests. All is bustle and confusion round me, the ladies pressing with their sums and their lessons. If you love me, do come on Friday. I shall watch and wait for you, and if you disappoint me, I shall weep. I wish you could know the thrill of delight which I experienced when, as I stood at the dining room window, I saw, as he whirled past, toss your little packet over the wall." Huddersfield market day was still the great period for events at Roe Head. Then girls, running round the corner of the house and peeping between tree stems, and up a shadowy lane, could catch a glimpse of a father or brother driving to market in his gig, might perhaps exchange a wave of the hand, or see, as Charlotte Brontë did from the window, a white packet tossed over the avail by some swift strong motion of an arm, the rest of the traveller's body unseen. Weary with the day's hard work, I am sitting down to write a few lines to my dear E. Excuse me if I say nothing but nonsense, for my mind is exhausted and dispirited. It is a stormy evening, and the wind is uttering a continual moaning sound that makes me feel very melancholy. At such times, in such moods as these, it is my nature to seek repose in some calm, tranquil idea, and I have now summoned up your image to give me rest. There you sit, upright and still, in your black dress and white scarf and pale, marble-like face, just like reality. I wish you would speak to me. If we should be separated, if it should be our lot to live at a great distance and never to see each other again, in old age, how I should conjure up the memory of my youthful days, and what a melancholy pleasure I should feel in dwelling on the recollection of my early friend. I have some qualities that make me very miserable, some feelings that you can have no participation in, that few, very few people in the world can at all understand. I don't pride myself on these peculiarities. I strive to conceal and suppress them as much as I can, but they burst out sometimes, and then those who see the explosion despise me, and I hate myself for days afterwards. I have just received your epistle and what accompanied it. I can't tell what should induce you and your sisters to waste your kindness on such a one as me. I'm obliged to them, and I hope you'll tell them so. I'm obliged to you also, more for your note than for your present. The first gave me pleasure, the last something like pain. The nervous disturbance, which is stated to have troubled her while she was at Miss W.'s, seems to have begun to distress her about this time. At least she herself speaks of her irritable condition, which was certainly only a temporary ailment. You have been very kind to me of late, and have spared me all those little sallies of ridicule, which, owing to my miserable and wretched touchiness of character, used formerly to make me wince as if I had been touched with a hot iron. Things that nobody else cares for enter into my mind and rankle there like venom. I know these feelings are absurd, and therefore I try to hide them, but they only sting the deeper for concealment. Compare this state of mind with the gentle resignation with which she had submitted to be put aside as useless, or told of her ugliness by her schoolfellows, only 3 years before. My life, since I saw you, has passed as monotonously and unbroken as ever. Nothing but teach, 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 from morning till night. The greatest variety I ever have is afforded by a letter from you, or by meeting with a pleasant new book. The Life of Oberlin and Lee Richmond's Domestic Portraiture are the last of this description. The latter work strongly attracted and strangely fascinated my attention. Beg, borrow, or steal it without delay, and read the memoir of Wilberforce. That short record of a brief, uneventful life, I shall never forget it. It is beautiful, not on account of the language in which it is written, not on account of the incidents it details, but because of the simple narrative it gives of a young, talented, sincere Christian. About this time Miss W. removed her school from the fine, open, breezy situation of Roe Head to Dewsbury Moor, only 2 or 3 miles distant. Her new residence was on a lower site, and the air was less exhilarating to one bred in the wild, hill village of Haworth. Emily had gone as teacher to a school at Halifax, where there were nearly 40 pupils. "I have had one letter from her since her departure," writes Charlotte on October 2nd, 1836. "It gives an appalling account of her duties. Hard labour from 6 in the morning to 11 at night, with only 1/2 hour of exercise between. This is slavery. I fear she can never stand it." When the sisters met at home in the Christmas holidays, they talked over their lives and the prospect which they afforded of employment and remuneration. They felt that it was a duty to relieve their father of the burden of their support, if not entirely, or that of all three, at least that of one or two, and naturally the lot devolved upon the elder ones to find some occupation which would enable them to do this. They knew that they were never likely to inherit much money. Mr. Brontë had but a small stipend, and was both charitable and liberal. Their aunt had an annuity of £50, but it reverted to others at her death, and her nieces had no right, and were the last persons in the world to reckon upon her savings. What could they do? Charlotte and Emily were trying teaching, and, as it seemed, without much success. The former, it is true, had the happiness of having a friend for her employer, and of being surrounded by those who knew her and loved her; but her salary was too small for her to save out of it, and her education did not entitle her to a larger. The sedentary and monotonous nature of the life, too, was preying upon her health and spirits, although, with necessity, as her mistress, she might hardly like to acknowledge this even to herself. But Emily, that free, wild, untamable spirit, never happy nor well but on the sweeping moors that gathered round her home, that hater of strangers, doomed to live amongst them, and not merely to live, but to slave in their service. What Charlotte could have borne patiently for herself, she could not bear for her sister. And yet what to do? She had once hoped that she herself might become an artist, and so earn her livelihood; but her eyes had failed her in the minute and useless labour which she had imposed upon herself with a view to this end. It was the household custom among these girls to sew till 9 o'clock at night. At that hour Miss Branwell generally went to bed, and her nieces' duties for the day were accounted done. They put away their work, and began to pace the room, backwards and forwards, up and down, as often with the candles extinguished for economy's sake as not, their figures glancing into the firelight and out into the shadow perpetually. At this time they talked over past cares and troubles, they planned for the future, and consulted each other as to their plans. In after years this was the time for discussing together the plots of their novels; and again, still later, this was the time for the last surviving sister to walk alone, from old accustomed habit, round and round the desolate room, thinking sadly upon the days that were no more. But this Christmas of 1836 was not without its hopes and daring aspirations. They had tried their hands at story writing in their miniature magazine long ago. They all of them made out perpetually. They had likewise attempted to write poetry, and had a modest confidence that they had achieved a tolerable success; but they knew that they might deceive themselves, and that sisters' judgments of each other's productions were likely to be too partial to be depended upon. So Charlotte, as the eldest, resolved to write to Southey. I believe, from an expression in a letter to be noticed hereafter, that she also consulted Coleridge, but I have not met with any part of that correspondence. On December 29th her letter to Southey was dispatched, and from an excitement not unnatural in a girl who has worked herself up to the pitch of writing to a poet laureate and asking his opinion of her poems, she used some high-flown expressions which, probably, gave him the idea that she was a romantic young lady, unacquainted with the realities of life. This most likely was the first of those adventurous letters that passed through the little post-office of Haworth. Morning after morning of the holidays slipped away, and there was no answer. The sisters had to leave home, and Emily to return to her distasteful duties, without knowing even whether Charlotte's letter had ever reached its destination. Not dispirited, however, by the delay, Branwell determined to try a similar venture, and addressed the following letter to Wordsworth. It was given by the poet to Mr. Quillinan in 1850, after the name of Brontë had become known and famous. I have no means of ascertaining what answer was returned by Mr. Wordsworth, but that he considered the letter remarkable may, I think, be inferred, both from its preservation and its recurrence to his memory when the real name of Currer Bell was made known to the public. Haworth, near Bradford, Yorkshire, January 19th, 1837. Sir, I most earnestly entreat you to read and pass your judgment upon what I have sent you, because from the day of my birth to this, the 19th year of my life, I have lived among secluded hills, where I could neither know what I was or what I could do. I read for the same reason that I ate or drank, because it was a real craving of nature. I wrote on the same principle as I spoke, out of the impulse and feelings of the mind, nor could I help it, for what came, came out, and there was the end of it. For as to self-conceit, that could not receive food from flattery, since to this hour not half a dozen people in the world know that I have ever penned a line. But a change has taken place now, sir, and I am arrived at an age wherein I must do something for myself. The powers I possess must be exercised to a definite end, and as I don't know them myself, I must ask of others what they are worth. Yet there is not one here to tell me, and still, if they are worthless, time will henceforth be too precious to be wasted on them. Do pardon me, sir, that I have ventured to come before one whose works I have most loved in our literature, and who most has been with me a divinity of the mind, laying before him one of my writings, and asking of him a judgment of its contents. I must come before someone from whose sentence there is no appeal, and such a one is he who has developed the theory of poetry as well as its practice, and both in such a way as to claim a place in the memory of 1,000 years to come. My aim, sir, is to push out into the open world, and for this I trust not poetry alone. That might launch the vessel, but could not bear her on. Sensible and scientific prose, bold and vigorous efforts in my walk in life, would give a farther title to the notice of the world. And then again, poetry ought to brighten and crown that name with glory. But nothing of all this can be ever begun without means, and as I don't possess these, I must in every shape strive to gain them. Surely in this day, when there is not a writing poet worth a sixpence, the field must be open if a better man can step forward. What I send you is the prefatory scene of a much longer subject, in which I have striven to develop strong passions and weak principles, struggling with a high imagination and acute feelings, till, as youth hardens towards age, evil deeds and short enjoyments end in mental misery and bodily ruin. Now, to send you the whole of this would be a mock upon your patience. What you see does not even pretend to be more than the description of an imaginative child. But read it, sir, and as you would hold a light to one in utter darkness, as you value your own kind-heartedness, return me an answer, if but one word, telling me whether I should write on or write no more. Forgive undue warmth, because my feelings in this matter cannot be cool, and believe me, sir, with deep respect, your really humble servant, P.B. Brontë. End of chapter 8.
Chapter 8 of the Life of Charlotte Brontë. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Charlotte Brontë by Elizabeth Gaskell, Volume 1, Chapter 8. The poetry enclosed seems to me by no means equal to parts of the letter, but as every one likes to judge for himself, I copy the 6 opening stanzas, about a third of the whole, and certainly not the worst. So where he reigns in glory bright, above those starry skies of night, amid his paradise of light, oh, why may I not be? Oft when awake on Christmas morn, in sleepless twilight laid forlorn, strange thoughts have o'er my head been borne, how he has died for me. And oft within my chamber lying, have I awakened myself with crying, from dreams where I beheld him dying, upon the accursed tree. And often has my mother said, while on her lap I laid my head, she feared for time I was not made, but for eternity. So I can read my title clear to mansions in the skies, and let me bid farewell to fear, and wipe my weeping eyes. I'll lay me down on this marble stone, and set the world aside, to see upon her ebon throne the moon in glory ride. Soon after Charlotte returned to Dewsbury Moor, she was distressed by a hearing that her friend E. was likely to leave the neighbourhood for a considerable length of time. February 20th. What shall I do without you? How long are we likely to be separated? Why are we to be denied each other's society? It is an inscrutable fatality. I long to be with you because it seems as if 2 or 3 days or weeks spent in your company would beyond measure strengthen me in the enjoyment of those feelings which I have so lately begun to cherish. You first pointed out to me that way in which I am so feebly endeavouring to travel, and now I cannot keep you by my side. I must proceed sorrowfully alone. Why are we to be divided? Surely it must be because we are in danger of loving each other too well, of losing sight of the Creator in idolatry of the creature. At first I could not say, "Thy will be done." I felt rebellious, but I knew it was wrong to feel so. Being left a moment alone this morning, I prayed fervently to be enabled to resign myself to every decree of God's will, though it should be dealt forth by a far severer hand than the present disappointment. Since then I have felt calmer and humbler, and consequently happier. Last Sunday I took up my Bible in a gloomy state of mind. I began to read. A feeling stole over me such as I have not known for many long years. A sweet, placid sensation, like those I remember, which used to visit me when I was a little child, and on Sunday evenings in the summer, stood by the open window reading the life of a certain French nobleman, who attained a purer and higher degree of sanctity than has been known since the days of the early martyrs. E.'s residence was equally within a walk from Dewsbury Moor, as it had been from Roe Head, and on Saturday afternoons both Mary and she used to call upon Charlotte, and often endeavoured to persuade her to return with them, and be the guest of one of them till Monday morning. But this was comparatively seldom. Mary says she visited us twice or thrice when she was at Mrs. W.'s. We used to dispute about politics and religion. She, a Tory clergyman's daughter, was always in a minority of one in our house of violent dissent and radicalism. She used to hear over again, delivered with authority, all the lectures I had been used to give her at school on despotic aristocracy, mercenary priesthood, etc. She had not energy to defend herself. Sometimes she owned to a little truth in it, but generally said nothing. Her feeble health gave her yielding manner, for she could never oppose anyone without gathering up all her strength for the struggle. Thus she would let me advise and patronize most imperiously, sometimes picking out any grain of sense there might be in what I said, but never allowing anyone materially to interfere with her independence of thought and action. Though her silence was sometimes left one under the impression that she agreed when she did not, she never gave a flattering opinion, and thus her words were golden, whether for praise or blame. Mary's father was a man of remarkable intelligence, but of strong, not to say violent, prejudices, all running in favour of republicanism and dissent. No other county but Yorkshire could have produced such a man. His brother had been a détenu in France, and had afterwards voluntarily taken up his residence there. Mr. T. himself had been much abroad, both on business and to see the great continental galleries of paintings. He spoke French perfectly, I have been told, when need was, but delighted usually in talking the broadest Yorkshire. He bought splendid engravings of the pictures which he particularly admired, and his house was full of works of art and of books, but he rather liked to present his rough side to any stranger or newcomer. He would speak his broadest, bring out his opinions on church and state in their most startling forms, and by, if he found his hearer could stand the shock, he would involuntarily show his warm, kind heart, and his true taste and real refinement. His family of 4 sons and 2 daughters were brought up on republican principles. Independence of thought and action were encouraged, no shams tolerated. They are scattered far and wide. Martha, the younger daughter, sleeps in the Protestant cemetery at Brussels. Mary is in New Zealand. Mr. T. is dead. And so life and death have dispersed the circle of violent radicals and dissenters, into which 20 years ago the little quiet, resolute clergyman's daughter was received, and by whom she was truly loved and honoured. January and February of 1837 had passed away, and still there was no reply from Southey. Probably she had lost expectation and almost hope when at length, in the beginning of March, she received the letter inserted in Mr. C. Southey's Life of his father, Volume 4, page 327. After accounting for his delay in replying to hers by the fact of a long absence from home, during which his letters had accumulated, whence it has lain unanswered till the last of a numerous file, not from disrespect or indifference to its contents, but because in truth it is not an easy task to answer it, nor a pleasant one to cast a damp over the high spirits and the generous desires of youth. He goes on to say, "What you are I can only infer from your letter, which appears to be written in sincerity, though I may suspect that you have used a fictitious signature. Be that as it may, the letter and the verses bear the same stamp, and I can well understand the state of mind they indicate. It is not my advice that you have asked as to the direction of your talents, but my opinion of them, and yet the opinion may be worth little, and the advice much. You evidently possess, and in no inconsiderable degree, what Wordsworth calls the faculty of verse. I am not depreciating it when I say that in these times it is not rare. Many volumes of poems are now published every year without attracting public attention, any one of which, if it had appeared half a century ago, would have obtained a high reputation for its author. Whoever, therefore, is ambitious of distinction in this way ought to be prepared for disappointment. But it is not with a view to distinction that you should cultivate this talent, if you consult your own happiness. I, who have made literature my profession, and devoted my life to it, and have never for a moment repented of the deliberate choice, think to myself, nevertheless, bound in duty to caution every young man who applies as an aspirant to me for encouragement and advice, against taking so perilous a course. You will say that a woman has no need of such a caution. There can be no peril in it for her. In a certain sense this is true, but there is a danger of which I would, with all kindness and all earnestness, warn you. The daydreams in which you habitually indulge are likely to induce a distempered state of mind, and in proportion as all the ordinary uses of the world seem to you flat and unprofitable, you will be unfitted for them without becoming fitted for anything else. Literature cannot be the business of a woman's life, and it ought not to be. The more she is engaged in her proper duties, the less leisure will she have for it, even as an accomplishment and a recreation. To those duties you have not yet been called, and when you are, you will be less eager for celebrity. You will not seek in imagination for excitement, of which the vicissitudes of this life, and the anxieties from which you must not hope to be exempted, be your state what it may, will bring with them but too much. But do not suppose that I disparage the gift which you possess, nor that I would discourage you from exercising it. I only exhort you so to think of it, and so to use it, as to render it conducive to your own permanent good. Write poetry for its own sake, not in a spirit of emulation, and not with view to celebrity. The less you aim at that, the more likely you will be to deserve and finally to obtain it. So written, it is wholesome both for the heart and soul. It may be made the surest means, next to religion, of soothing the mind and elevating it. You may embody it in your best thoughts, in your wisest feelings, and in so doing discipline and strengthen them. Farewell, madame. It is not because I have forgotten that I was once young myself that I write to you in this strain, but because I remember it. You will neither doubt my sincerity nor my goodwill, and however ill what has here been said may accord with your present views and temper, the longer you live, the more reasonable it will appear to you. Though I may be but an ungracious adviser, you will allow me, therefore, to subscribe myself, with the best wishes for your happiness, here and hereafter, your true friend, Robert Southey. I was with Miss Brontë when she received Miss Cuthbert Southey's note, requesting her permission to insert the foregoing letter in his father's life. She said to me, "Mr. Southey's letter was kind and admirable, a little stringent, but it did me good." It is partly because I think it so admirable, and partly because it tends to bring out her character, as shown in the following reply, that I have taken the liberty of inserting the foregoing extracts from it. Sir, March 16th. I cannot rest till I have answered your letter, even though by addressing you a second time I should appear a little intrusive, but I must thank you for the kind and wise advice you have condescended to give me. I have not ventured to hope for such a reply, so considerate in its tone, so noble in its spirit. I must suppress what I feel, or you will think me foolishly enthusiastic. At the first perusal of your letter, I felt only shame and regret that I had ever ventured to trouble you with my crude rhapsody. I felt a painful heat rise to my face when I thought of the quires of paper I had covered with what once gave me so much delight, but which now was only a source of confusion. But after I had thought a little and read it again and again, the prospect seemed clear. You do not forbid me to write. You do not say that what I write is utterly destitute of merit. You only warn me against the folly of neglecting real duties for the sake of imaginative pleasures, of writing for the love of fame, for the selfish excitement of emulation. You kindly allow me to write poetry for its own sake, provided I leave undone nothing which I ought to do, in order to pursue that single, absorbing, exquisite gratification. I am afraid, sir, you think me very foolish. I know the first letter I wrote to you was all senseless trash from beginning to end, but I am not altogether the idle, dreaming being it would seem to denote. My father is a clergyman of limited, though competent, income, and I am the eldest of his children. He expended quite as much in my education as he could afford in justice to the rest. I thought it therefore my duty, when I left school, to become a governess. In that capacity I find enough to occupy my thoughts all day long, and my head and hands too, without having a moment's time for one dream of the imagination. In the evenings, I confess, I do think, but I never trouble anyone else with my thoughts. I carefully avoid any appearance of preoccupation and eccentricity, which might lead those I live amongst to suspect the nature of my pursuits. Following my father's advice, who from my childhood had counselled me, just in the wise and friendly tone of your letter, I have endeavoured not only attentively to observe all the duties a woman ought to fulfill, but to feel deeply interested in them. I don't always succeed, for sometimes when I'm teaching or sewing I would rather be reading or writing, but I try to deny myself, and my father's approbation amply rewarded me for the privation. Once more allow me to thank you with sincere gratitude. I trust I shall never more feel ambitious to see my name in print. If the wish should rise, I'll look at Southey's letter and suppress it. It is honour enough for me that I have written to him and received an answer. That letter is consecrated. No one shall ever see it but Papa and my brother and sisters. Again I thank you. This incident, I suppose, will be renewed no more. If I live to be an old woman, I shall remember it 30 years hence as a bright dream. The signature which you suspected of being fictitious is my real name. Again, therefore, I must sign myself, C. Brontë. P.S. Pray, sir, excuse me for writing to you a second time. I could not help writing, partly to tell you how thankful I am for your kindness, and partly to let you know that your advice shall not be wasted, however sorrowfully and reluctantly it may be at first followed. C.B. I cannot deny myself the gratification of inserting Southey's reply. Keswick, March 22nd, 1837. Dear Madame, your letter has given me great pleasure, and I should not forgive myself if I did not tell you so. You have received admonition as considerately and as kindly as it was given. Let me now request that, if you ever should come to these lakes while I am living here, you will let me see you. You would then think of me afterwards with the more goodwill, because you would perceive that there is neither severity nor moroseness in the state of mind to which years and observation have brought me. It is, by God's mercy, in our power to attain a degree of self-government which is essential to our own happiness, and contributes greatly to that of those around us. Take care of over-excitement and endeavor to keep a quiet mind. Even for your health, it is the best advice that can be given to you. Your moral and spiritual improvement will then keep pace with the culture of your intellectual powers. And now, Madame, God bless you. Farewell, and believe me to be your sincere friend, Robert Southey. Of this second letter also she spoke, and told me that it contained an invitation for her to go and see the poet if ever she visited the lakes. But there was no money to spare, she said, nor any prospect of my ever earning money enough to have the chance of so great a pleasure, so I gave up thinking of it. At the time we conversed together on the subject, we were at the lakes, but Southey was dead. This stringent letter made her put aside for a time any idea of literary enterprise. She bent her whole energy towards the fulfillment of her duties in hand, but her occupation was not sufficient food for her great forces of intellect, and they cried out perpetually, "Give, give," while the comparatively less breezy air of Dewsbury Moor told her upon her health and spirits more and more. On August 27th, 1837, she writes, "I am again at Dewsbury, engaged in the old business, teach, teach, teach. When will you come home? Make haste! You have been at Bath long enough for all purposes. By this time you have acquired polish enough, I am sure. If the varnish is laid on much thicker, I am afraid the good wood underneath will be quite concealed, and your Yorkshire friends won't stand that. Come, come, I'm getting really tired of your absence. Saturday after Saturday comes around, and I can have no hope of hearing your knock at the door, and then being told that Miss E is come. Oh dear! In this monotonous life of mine, that was a pleasant event. I wish it would recur again, but it will take 2 or 3 interviews before the stiffness, the estrangement of this long separation will wear away." About this time she forgot to return a work-bag she had borrowed by a messenger, and in repairing her error she says, "These aberrations of memory warn me pretty intelligibly that I am getting past my prime." And the same tone of despondency runs through the following letter. "I wish exceedingly that I could come to you before Christmas, but it is impossible. Another 3 weeks must elapse before I shall again have my comforter beside me, under the roof of my own dear quiet home. If I could always live with you, and daily read the Bible with you, if your lips and mine could at the same time drink the same draught from the same pure fountain of mercy, I hope, I trust, I might one day become better, far better than my evil wandering thoughts, my corrupt heart, cold to the spirit and warm to the flesh, will now permit me to be. I often planned the pleasant life which we might lead together, strengthening each other in that power of self-denial, that hallowed and glowing devotion with the first saints of God often attained to. My eyes fill with tears when I contrast the bliss of such a state, brightened by hopes of the future, with the melancholy state I now live in, uncertain that I ever felt true contrition, wandering in thought and deed, longing for holiness which I shall never, never obtain, smitten at times to the heart with the conviction that ghastly Calvinistic doctrines are true, darkened in short by the very shadows of spiritual death. If Christian perfection be necessary to salvation, I shall never be saved. My heart is a very hotbed for sinful thoughts, and when I decide on an action I scarcely remember to look to my Redeemer for direction. I know not how to pray. I cannot bend my life to the grand end of doing good. I go on constantly seeking my own pleasure, pursuing the gratification of my own desires. I forget God, and will not God forget me? And meantime, I know the greatness of Jehovah. I acknowledge the perfection of his word. I adore the purity of the Christian faith. My theory is right, my practice horribly wrong. The Christmas holidays came, and she and Anne returned to the parsonage, and to that happy home circle in which alone their natures expanded. Amongst all other people they shriveled up more or less. Indeed, there were only 1 or 2 strangers who could be admitted among the sisters without producing the same result. Emily and Anne were bound up in their lives and interests like twins. The former from reserve, the latter from timidity, avoided all friendships and intimacies beyond their family. Emily was impervious to influence. She never came in contact with public opinion, and her own decision of what was right and fitting was a law for her conduct and appearance, with which she allowed no one to interfere. Her love was poured out on Anne, as Charlotte's was on her, but the affection among all 3 was stronger than either death or life. E. was eagerly welcomed by Charlotte, freely admitted by Emily, and kindly received by Anne, whenever she could visit them, and this Christmas she had promised to do so, but her coming had to be delayed on account of a little domestic accident detailed in the following letter. December 29th, 1837. I am sure you will have thought me very remiss in not sending my promised letter long before now, but I have a sufficient and very melancholy excuse in an accident that befell our old faithful Tabby a few days after my return home. She was gone out into the village on some errand when, as she was descending the steep street, her foot slipped on the ice and she fell. It was dark and no one saw her mischance, till after a time her groans attracted the attention of a passer-by. She was lifted up and carried into the druggist's near, and, after the examination, it was discovered that she had completely shattered and dislocated one leg. Unfortunately, the fracture could not be set till 6 o'clock the next morning, as no surgeon was to be had before that time. And she now lies at our house in a very doubtful and dangerous state. Of course, we are all exceedingly distressed at the circumstance, for she was like one of our own family. Since the event, we have been almost without assistance. A person has dropped in now and then to do the drudgery, but we have as yet been able to procure no regular servant, and consequently the whole work of the house, as well as the additional duty of nursing Tabby, falls on ourselves. Under these circumstances, I dare not press your visit here, at least until she is pronounced out of danger. It would be too selfish of me. Aunt wished me to give you this information before, but Papa and all the rest were anxious I should delay until we saw whether matters took a more settled aspect, and I myself kept putting it off from day to day, most bitterly reluctant to give up all the pleasure I had anticipated so long. However, remembering what you told me, namely that you had commended the matter to a higher decision than ours, and that you were resolved to submit with resignation to that decision, whatever it might be, I hold it my duty to yield also and to be silent, and may be all for the best. I fear, if you had been here during this severe weather, your visit would have been of no advantage to you, for the moors are blockaded with snow, and you would never have been able to get out. After this disappointment, I never dare reckon with certainty on the enjoyment of a pleasure again. It seems as if some fatality stood between you and me. I am not good enough for you, and you must be kept from the contamination of too intimate society. I would urge your visit yet, I would entreat and press it, but the thought comes across me. Should Tabby die while you're in the house, I should never forgive myself. No, it must not be, and in 1,000 ways the consciousness of that mortifies and disappoints me most keenly, and I am not the only one who is disappointed. All in the house were looking to your visit with eagerness. Papa says he highly approves of my friendship with you, and he wishes me to continue it through life. A good neighbour of the Brontes, a clever, intelligent Yorkshire woman, who keeps a druggist's shop in Haworth. From her occupation, her experience, and excellent sense, holds the position of village doctress and nurse, and, as such, has been a friend in many a time of trial and sickness and death in the households round. Told me a characteristic little incident connected with Tabby's fractured leg. Mr. Brontë is truly generous and regardful of all deserving claims. Tabby had lived with them for 10 or 12 years, and was, as Charlotte expressed it, one of the family. But on the other hand, she was past the age of any very active service, being nearer 70 than 60, and at the time of the accident she had a sister living in the village, and the savings she had accumulated during many years' service formed a competency for one in her rank of life. Or if, in this time of sickness, she fell short of any comforts which her state rendered necessary, the parsonage should supply them. So reasoned Miss Branwell, the prudent, not to say anxious aunt, looked to the limited contents of Mr. Bronte's purse, and the unprovided for future of her nieces, who were, moreover, losing the relaxation of the holidays in close attendance upon Tabby. Miss Branwell urged her views upon Mr. Brontë as soon as the immediate danger to the old servant's life was over. He refused at first to listen to the careful advice. It was repugnant to his liberal nature. But Miss Branwell persevered, urged economical motives, pressed on his love for his daughters. He gave way. Tabby was to be removed to her sister's, and there nursed and cared for, Mr. Brontë coming in with his aid when her own resources fell short. This decision was communicated to the girls. There were symptoms of a quiet but sturdy rebellion that winter afternoon in the small precincts of Haworth parsonage. They made one unanimous and stiff remonstrance. Tabby had tended them in their childhood. They and none other should tend her in her infirmity and age. At tea-time they were sad and silent, and the meal went away untouched by any of the three. So it was at breakfast. They did not waste many words on the subject, but each word they did utter was weighty. They struck eating till the resolution was rescinded, and Tabby was allowed to remain a helpless invalid, entirely dependent upon them. Herein was the strong feeling of duty, being paramount to pleasure, which lay at the foundation of Charlotte's character, made most apparent, for we have seen how she yearned for her friend's company. But it was to be obtained only by shrinking from what she esteemed right, and that she never did, whatever might be the sacrifice. She had another weight on her mind this Christmas. I have said that the air of Dewsbury Moor did not agree with her, though she herself was hardly aware how much her life there was affecting her health. But Anne had begun to suffer just before the holidays, and Charlotte watched over her younger sisters with the jealous vigilance of some wild creature that changes her very nature if danger threatens her young. Anne had a slight cough, a pain at her side, a difficulty of breathing. Miss W. considered it as little more than a common cold, but Charlotte felt every indication of incipient consumption as a stab at her heart. Remembering Maria and Elizabeth, whose places once knew them and should know them no more. Stung by anxiety for this little sister, she upbraided Miss W. for her fancied indifference to Anne's state of health. Miss W. felt these reproaches keenly and wrote to Mr. Brontë about them. He immediately replied most kindly, expressing his fear that Charlotte's apprehensions and anxieties respecting her sister had led her to give utterance to overexcited expressions of alarm. Through Miss W.'s kind consideration, Anne was a year longer at school than her friends intended. At the close of the half-year, Miss W. sought for the opportunity of an explanation of each other's words, and the issue proved that falling out of faithful friends, renewing is of love. And so ended the first, last, and only difference Charlotte ever had with good, kind Miss W. Still her heart had received a shock in the perception of Anne's delicacy, and all these holidays she watched over her with the longing, fond anxiety which is so full of sudden pangs of fear. Emily had given up her situation in the Halifax school at the expiration of 6 months of arduous trial on account of her health, which could only be re-established by the bracing moorland air and free life of home. Tabby's illness had preyed on the family resources. I doubt whether Branwell was maintaining himself at this time. For some unexplained reason he had given up the idea of becoming a student of painting at the Royal Academy, and his prospects in life were uncertain, and had yet to be settled. So Charlotte had quietly to take up her burden of teaching again, and return to her previous monotonous life. End of chapter 8.
Section 12 of the Life of Charlotte Brontë. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shalifa William. The Life of Charlotte Brontë by Elizabeth Gaskell. Volume 1, Section 12. Brave heart, ready to die in harness, she went back to her work, and made no complaint, hoping to subdue the weakness that was gaining ground upon her. About this time she would turn sick and trembling at any sudden noise, and could hardly repress her screams when startled. This showed a fearful degree of physical weakness in one who was generally so self-controlled, and the medical man, whom at length, through Miss W.'s entreaty, she was led to consult, insisted on her return to the parsonage. She had led too sedentary a life, he said, and the soft summer air blowing round her home, the sweet company of those she loved, the release, the freedom of life in her own family were needed to save either reason or life. So, as one higher than she had overruled, that for a time she might relax her strain, she returned to Haworth, and after a season of utter quiet, her father sought for her the enlivening society of her two friends, Mary and Martha T. At the conclusion of the following letter, written to the then absent E., there is, I think, as pretty a glimpse of a married group of young people as need be, and like all descriptions of doing, as distinct from thinking or feeling, in letters, it saddens one in proportion to the vivacity of the picture of what was once and is now utterly swept away. Haworth, June 9th, 1838. I received your packet of dispatches on Wednesday. It was brought me by Mary and Martha, who have been staying at Haworth for a few days. They leave us to-day. You will be surprised at the date of this letter. I ought to be at Shrewsbury Moor, you know, but I stayed as long as I was able, and at length I neither could nor dared stay any longer. My health and spirits had utterly failed me, and the medical man whom I consulted enjoined me, as I valued my life, to go home. So home I went, and the change has at once roused and soothed me, and I am now, I trust, fairly in the way to be myself again. A calm and even mind like yours cannot conceive the feelings of the shattered wretch who is now writing to you, when after weeks of mental and bodily anguish not to be described, something like peace began to dawn again. Mary is far from well. She breathes short, has a pain in her chest, and frequent flushings of fever. I cannot tell you what agony these symptoms give me. They remind me too strongly of my two sisters, whom no power of medicine could save. Martha is now very well. She has kept in a continual flow of good humour during her stay here, and has consequently been very fascinating. They are making such a noise about me, I cannot write any more. Mary is playing on the piano, Martha is chattering as fast as her little tongue can run, and Branwell is standing before her, laughing at her vivacity. Charlotte grew much stronger in this quiet, happy period at home. She paid occasional visits to her two great friends, and they in return came to Haworth. At one of their houses, I suspect, she met with the person to whom the following letter refers, some one having a slight resemblance to the character of St. John in the last volume of Jane Eyre, and like him in holy orders. March 12th, 1839. I had a kindly leaning towards him, because he is an amiable and well-disposed man. Yet I had not and could not have that intense attachment which would make me willing to die for him, and if I ever marry, it must be in that light of adoration that I will regard my husband. 10 to 1 I shall never have the chance again, but n'importe. Moreover, I was aware that he knew so little of me he could hardly be conscious to whom he was writing. Why, it would startle him to see me in my natural home character. He would think I was a wild romantic enthusiast indeed. I could not sit all day long making a grave face before my husband. I would laugh and satirize and say whatever came into my head first, and if he were a clever man and loved me, the whole world, weighed in the balance against the smallest wish, should be light as air. So that her first proposal of marriage was quietly declined and put on one side. Matrimony did not enter into the scheme of her life, but good, sound, earnest labour did. The question, however, was as yet undecided in what direction she should employ her forces. She had been discouraged in literature. Her eyes failed her in the minute kind of drawing which she practised when she wanted to express an idea. Teaching seemed to her at this time, as it does to most women at all times, the only way of earning an independent livelihood. But neither she nor her sisters were naturally fond of children. The hieroglyphics of childhood were an unknown language to them, for they had never been much with those younger than themselves. I am inclined to think, too, that they had not the happy knack of imparting information, which seems to be a separate gift from the faculty of acquiring it, a kind of sympathetic tact which instinctively perceives the difficulties that impede comprehension in a child's mind, and that yet are too vague and uninformed for it, with its half-developed powers of expression, to explain by words. Consequently, teaching very young children was anything but a delightful task to the three Brontë sisters. With older girls, verging on womanhood, they might have done better, especially if these had any desire for improvement. But the education which the village clergyman's daughters had received did not as yet qualify them to undertake the charge of advanced pupils. They knew but little French, and were not proficient in music. I doubt whether Charlotte could play at all. But they were all strong again, and at any rate Charlotte and Anne must put their shoulders to the wheel. One daughter was needed at home to stay with Mr. Brontë and Miss Branwell, to be the young and active member in a household of 4, whereof 3, the father, the aunt, and faithful Tabby, were past middle age. And Emily, who suffered and drooped more than her sisters when away from Haworth, was the one appointed to remain. Anne was the first to meet with the situation. April 15th, 1839. I could not write to you in the week you requested, as about that time we were very busy in preparing for Anne's departure. Poor child! She left us last Monday. No one went with her. It was her own wish that she might be allowed to go alone, as she thought she could manage better and summon more courage if thrown entirely upon her own resources. We have had one letter from her since she went. She expresses herself very well satisfied, and says that Mrs. is extremely kind. The 2 eldest children alone are under her care, the rest are confined to the nursery, with which and its occupants she has nothing to do. I hope she'll do. You would be astonished what a sensible, clever letter she writes. It is only the talking part that I fear. But I do seriously apprehend that Mrs. will sometimes conclude that she has a natural impediment in her speech. For my own part, I am as yet wanting a situation, like a housemaid out of place. By the way, I have lately discovered I have quite a talent for cleaning, sweeping up hearths, dusting rooms, making beds, etc. So if everything else fails, I can turn my hand to that, if anybody will give me good wages for little labour. I won't be cook. I hate soothing. I won't be nursery-maid, nor a lady's maid, far less a lady's companion, or a mantua-maker, or a straw bonnet-maker, or a taker-in of plain work. I won't be anything but a housemaid. With regard to my visit to G., I have as yet received no invitation, but if I should be asked, though I should feel it a great act of self-denial to refuse, yet I have almost made up my mind to do so, though the society of the T.'s is one of the most rousing pleasures I have ever known. Good-bye, my darling E., etc. P.S. Strike out that word darling. It is humbug. Where's the use of protestations? We've known each other, and liked each other a good while. That's enough. Not many weeks after this was written, Charlotte also became engaged as a governess. I intend carefully to abstain from introducing the names of any living people, respecting whom I may have to tell unpleasant truths, or to quote severe remarks from Miss Brontë's letters, but it is necessary that the difficulties she had to encounter in her various phases of life should be fairly and frankly made known, before the force of what was resisted can be at all understood. I was once speaking to her about Agnes Grey, the novel in which her sister Anne pretty literally describes her own experience as a governess, and alluding more particularly to the account of the stoning of the little nestlings in the presence of the parent birds. She said that none but those who had been in the position of a governess could ever realize the dark side of respectable human nature, under no great temptation to crime, but daily giving way to selfishness and ill temper, till its conduct towards those dependent on it sometimes amounts to a tyranny of which one would rather be the victim than the inflictor. We can only trust in such cases that the employees err rather from a density of perception and an absence of sympathy than from any natural cruelty of disposition. Among several things of the same kind, which I well remember, she told me what had once occurred to herself. She had been entrusted with the care of a little boy, 3 or 4 years old, during the absence of his parents on a day's excursion, and particularly enjoined to keep him out of the stable-yard. His elder brother, a lad of 8 or 9, and not a pupil of Miss Bronte's, tempted the little fellow into the forbidden place. She followed, and tried to induce him to come away, but instigated by his brother, he began throwing stones at her, and one of them hit her so severe a blow on the temple that the lads were alarmed into obedience. The next day, in full family conclave, the mother asked Miss Brontë what occasioned the mark on her forehead. She simply replied, "An accident, ma'am," and no further inquiry was made. But the children, both brothers and sisters, had been present, and honoured her for not telling tales. From that time she began to obtain influence over all, more or less, according to their different characters, and as she insensibly gained their affection, her own interest in them was increasing. But one day, at the children's dinner, the small truant of the stable-yard, in a little demonstrative gush, said, putting his hand in hers, "I love you, Miss Brontë." Whereupon the mother exclaimed before all the children, "Love the governess, my dear?" The family into which she first entered was, I believe, that of a wealthy Yorkshire manufacturer. The following extracts from her correspondence at this time will show how painfully the restraint of a new mode of life pressed upon her. The first is from a letter to Emily, beginning with one of the tender expressions in which, in spite of humbug, she indulged herself. "My dear love, my bonny love," are her terms of address to this beloved sister. June 8th, 1839. I have striven hard to be pleased with my new situation. The country, the house, and the grounds are, as I have said, divine. But alack a day, there is such a thing as seeing all beautiful around you, pleasant woods, wide paths, green lawns, and blue sunshiny sky, and not having a free moment or a free thought left to enjoy them. The children are constantly with me. As for correcting them, I quickly found that was out of the question. They are to do as they like. A complaint to the mother only brings black looks on myself, and unjust partial excuses to screen the children. I have tried that plan once, and succeeded so notably I shall try no more. I said in my last letter that Mrs. did not know me. I now begin to find she does not intend to know me, that she cares nothing about me, except to contrive how the greatest possible quantity of labour may be got out of me, and to that end she overwhelms me with oceans of needlework, yards of cambric to hem, muslin nightcaps to make, and above all things dolls to dress. I do not think she likes me at all, because I can't help being shy in such an entirely novel scene, surrounded, as I have hitherto been, by strange and constantly changing faces. I used to think I should like to be in the stir of grand folks' society, but I have had enough of it. It is dreary work to look on and listen. I see more clearly than I have ever done before that a private governess has no existence, is not considered as a living rational being, except as connected with the wearisome duties she has to fulfil. One of the pleasantest afternoons I have spent here, indeed the only one at all pleasant, was when Mr. walked out with his children, and I had orders to follow a little behind. As he strolled on through his fields, with his magnificent Newfoundland dog at his side, he looked very like what a frank, wealthy, conservative gentleman ought to be. He spoke freely and unaffected to the people he met, and though he indulged his children and allowed them to tease himself far too much, he would not suffer them grossly to insult others. Written in pencil to a friend. July 1839. I cannot procure ink without going to the drawing-room, where I do not wish to go. I should have written to you long since, and told you every detail of the utterly new scene into which I have lately been cast, had I not been daily expecting a letter from yourself, and wondering and lamenting that you did not write, for you will remember it was your turn. I must not bother you too much with my sorrows, of which I fear you have heard an exaggerated account. If you were near me, perhaps I might be tempted to tell you all, to grow egotistical and pour out the long history of a private governess's trials and crosses in her first situation. As it is, I will only ask you to imagine the miseries of a reserved wretch like me, thrown at once into the midst of a large family, at a time when they were particularly gay, and the house was filled with company, all strangers, people whose faces I had never seen before. In this state I had charge given me of a set of pampered, spoiled, turbulent children, whom I was expected constantly to amuse, as well as to instruct. I soon found that the constant demand on my stock of animal spirits reduced them to the lowest states of exhaustion. At times I felt, and I suppose seemed, depressed. To my astonishment, I was taken to task on the subject by Mrs. with a sternness of manner and a harshness of language scarcely credible. Like a fool, I cried most bitterly. I could not help it. My spirits quite failed me at first. I thought I had done my best, strained every nerve to please her, and to be treated in that way, merely because I was shy and sometimes melancholy, was too bad. At first I was for giving all up and going home, but after a little reflection I determined to summon what energy I had, and to weather the storm. I said to myself, I have never yet quitted a place without gaining a friend. Adversity is a good school. The poor are born to labour, and the dependent to endure. I resolved to be patient, to command my feelings, and to take what came. The ordeal, I reflected, would not last many weeks, and I trusted it would do me good. I recollected the fable of the willow and the oak. I bent quietly, and now I trust the storm is blowing over me. Mrs. is generally considered an agreeable woman. So she is, I doubt not, in general society. She behaves somewhat more civilly to me now than she did at first, and the children are a little more manageable. But she does not know my character, and she does not wish to know it. I have never had 5 minutes' conversation with her since I came, except while she was scolding me. I have no wish to be pitied, except by yourself. If I were talking to you, I could tell you much more. To Emily, about this time. My bonny love, I was as glad of your letter as tongue can express. It is a real genuine pleasure to hear from home, a thing to be saved till bedtime, when one has a moment's quiet and rest to enjoy it thoroughly. Write whenever you can. I could like to be at home. I could like to work in a mill. I could like to feel some mental liberty. I could like this weight of restraint to be taken off. But the holidays will come. Coraggio. Her temporary engagement in this uncongenial family ended in the July of this year, not before the constant strain upon her spirits and strength had again affected her health, but when this delicacy became apparent in palpitations and shortness of breathing, it was treated as affectation, as a phase of imaginary indisposition which could be dissipated by good scolding. She had been brought up rather in a school of Spartan endurance than in one of maudlin self-indulgence, and could bear many a pain and relinquish many a hope in silence. After she had been at home about a week, her friend proposed that she should accompany her in some little excursion, having pleasure alone for its object. She caught at the idea most eagerly at first, but her hope stood still, waned, and had almost disappeared before, after many delays, it was realized. In its fulfilment at last, It was a favourable specimen of many a similar air-bubble dancing before her eyes in her brief career, in which stern realities rather than pleasure formed the leading incidents. July 26th, 1839. Your proposal has almost driven me clean daft. If you don't understand that ladylike expression, you must ask me what it means when I see you. The fact is, an excursion with you anywhere, whether to Cleghorn or Canada, just by ourselves, would be to me most delightful. I should indeed like to go, but I can't get leave of absence for longer than a week, and I'm afraid that would not suit you. Must I then give it up entirely? I feel as if I could not. I never had such a chance of enjoyment before. I do want to see you and talk to you and be with you. When do you wish to go? Could I meet you at Leeds? To take a gig from Haworth to B would be to me a very serious increase of expense, and I happen to be very low in cash. Oh, rich people seem to have many pleasures at their command, which we are debarred from. However, no repining. Say when you go, and I shall be able in my answer to say decidedly whether I can accompany you or not. I must, I will, I'm set upon it. I'll be obstinate and bear down all opposition. P.S. Since writing the above, I find that Aunt and Papa have determined to go to Liverpool for a fortnight, and take us all with them. It is stipulated, however, that I should give up the Cleethorpes scheme. I yield reluctantly. I fancy that about this time Mr. Brontë found it necessary, either from failing health or the increased populousness of the parish, to engage the assistance of a curate. At least it is in a letter written this summer that I find mention of the first of a succession of curates, who henceforward revolved round Haworth parsonage, and made an impression on the mind of one of its inmates which she has conveyed pretty distinctly to the world. The Haworth curate brought his clerical friends and neighbours about the place, and for a time the incursions of these, near the parsonage tea-time, formed occurrences by which the quietness of the life there was varied, sometimes pleasantly, sometimes disagreeably. The little adventure recorded at the end of the following letter is uncommon in the lot of most women, and is a testimony in this case to the unusual power of attraction, though so plain a feature, which Charlotte possessed when she let herself go in the happiness and freedom of home. August 4th, 1839. The Liverpool journey is yet a matter of talk, a sort of castle in the air, but between you and me, I fancy it is very doubtful whether it will ever assume a more solid shape. Aunt, like many other elderly people, likes to talk of such things, but when it comes to putting them into actual execution, she rather falls off. Such being the case, I think you and I had better adhere to our first plan of going somewhere together independently of other people. I have got leave to accompany you for a week, at the utmost a fortnight, but no more. Where do you wish to go? Burlington, I should think, from what M. says, would be as eligible a place as any. When do you set off? Arrange all these things according to your convenience. I shall start no objections. The idea of seeing the sea, of being near it, watching its changes by sunrise, sunset, moonlight, and noonday, in calm, perhaps in storm, fills and satisfies my mind. I shall be discontented at nothing. And then I am not to be with a set of people with whom I have nothing in common, who would be nuisances and bores, but with you, whom I like and know, and who knows me. I have an odd circumstance to relate to you. Prepare for a hearty laugh. The other day, Mr. Blank, a vicar, came to spend the day with us, bringing with him his own curate. The latter gentleman, by name Mr. B., is a young Irish clergyman, fresh from Dublin University. It was the first time we had any of us seen him, but however, after the manner of his countrymen, he soon made himself at home. His character quickly appeared in his conversation, witty, lively, ardent, clever too, but deficient in the dignity and discretion of an Englishman. At home, you know, I talk with ease, and am never shy, never weighed down and oppressed by that miserable mauvaise honte which torments and constrains me elsewhere. So I conversed with this Irishman, and laughed at his jests, and though I saw faults in his character, excused them because of the amusement his originality afforded. I cooled a little indeed, and drew in towards the latter part of the evening, because he began to season his conversation with something of Hibernian flattery, which I did not quite relish. However, they went away, and no more was thought about them. A few days after, I got a letter, the direction of which puzzled me, it being in a hand I was not accustomed to see. Evidently it was neither from you nor Mary, my only correspondence. Having opened and read it, it proved to be a declaration of attachment and proposal of matrimony, expressed in the ardent language of the sapient young Irishman. I hope you are laughing heartily. This is not like one of my adventures, is it? It more nearly resembles Martha's. I am certainly doomed to be an old maid. Never mind, I made up my mind to that fate ever since I was 12 years old. Well, thought I have heard of love at first sight, but this beats all. I leave you to guess what my answer would be, convinced that you will not do me the injustice of guessing wrong. On the 14th of August she still writes from Haworth. I have in vain packed my box and prepared everything for our anticipated journey. It so happens that I can get no conveyance this week or the next. The only gig let out to hire in Haworth is at Harrogate, and likely to remain there, for aught I can hear. Papa decidedly objects to my going by the coach, and walking to B., though I am sure I could manage it. Aunt declaims against the weather, and the roads, and the four winds of heaven. So I am in a fix, and what is worse, so are you. On reading over for the second or third time your last letter, which, by the by, was written in such hieroglyphics that at the first hasty perusal I could hardly make out 2 consecutive words, I find you intimate that I leave this journey till Thursday. I shall be too late. I grieve that I should have so inconvenienced you, but I need not talk of either Friday or Saturday now, for I rather imagine there is small chance of my ever going at all. The elders of the house have never cordially quiesced in the measure, and now that impediments seem to start up at every step, opposition grows more open. Papa indeed would willingly indulge me, but this very kindness of his makes me doubt whether I ought to draw upon it. So, though I could battle out aunt's discontent, I yield to papa's indulgence. He does not say so, but I know he would rather I stayed at home, and aunt meant well too, I dare say, but I am provoked that she reserved the expression of her decided disapproval till all was settled between you and myself. Reckon on me no more. Leave me out in your calculations. Perhaps I ought in the beginning to have had prudence sufficient to shut my eyes against such a prospect of pleasure, so as to deny myself the hope of it. Be as angry as you please with me for disappointing you. I did not intend it, and have only one thing more to say. If you do not go immediately to the sea, will you come to see us at Haworth? This invitation is not mine only, but papa's and aunt's. However, a little more patience, a little more delay, and she enjoyed the pleasure she had wished for so much. She and her friend went to Easton for a fortnight in the latter part of September. It was here she received her first impressions of the sea. October 24th. Have you forgotten the sea by this time, E.? Is it grown dim in your mind? Or can you still see it, dark blue and green, and foam white, and hear it roaring roughly when the wind is high, or rushing softly when it is calm? I am as well as need be, and very fat. I think of Easton very often, and of worthy Mr. H. and his kind-hearted helpmate, and of our pleasant walks to H. Wood and to Boynton, our merry evenings, our romps with little Henshin, etc., etc. If we both live, this period of our lives will long be a theme for pleasant recollection. Did you chance, in your letter to Mr. H., to mention my spectacles? I am sadly inconvenienced by the want of them. I can neither read, write, nor draw with comfort in their absence. I hope Madame won't refuse to give them up. Excuse the brevity of this letter, for I have been drawing all day, and my eyes are so tired, it is quite a labour to write. But as the vivid remembrance of this pleasure died away, an accident occurred to make the actual duties of life press somewhat heavily for a time. December 21st, 1839. We are at present, and have been during the last month, rather busy, as for that space of time we have been without a servant, except a little girl to run errands. Poor Tabby became so lame that she was at length obliged to leave us. She is residing with her sister in a little house of her own, which she bought with her savings a year or two since. She is very comfortable and wants nothing, as she is in near we see her very often. In the meantime Emily and I are sufficiently busy, as you may suppose. I manage the ironing and keep the rooms clean. Emily does the baking and attends to the kitchen. We are such odd animals that we prefer this mode of contrivance to having a new face amongst us. Besides, we do not despair of Tabby's return, and she shall not be supplanted by a stranger in her absence. I excited Aunt's wrath very much by burning the clothes the first time I attempted to iron, but I do better now. Human feelings are queer things. I am much happier black-leading the stoves, making the beds, and sweeping the floors at home, than I should be living like a fine lady anywhere else. I must indeed drop my subscription to the Jews, because I have no money to keep it up. I ought to have announced this intention to you before, but I quite forgot I was a subscriber. I intend to force myself to take another situation when I get one, though I hate and abhor the very thoughts of governesship. But I must do it, and therefore I heartily wish I could hear of a family where they need such a commodity as a governess. End of Section 12.